Defense is one of the most reliable as well as strategically rich defenses to d4. We reach this fascinating opening after the moves d4, taking space in the center. In response to d4, black can play the solid d5, taking a fair share of the center, but black can also remain flexible with knight f6, developing the knight as well as preventing e4. In response to knight f6, white typically takes more space in the center with c4. Controlling as much of the center as possible, black signals the possibility of a Nimzo Indian defense by playing e6, supporting the center as well as preparing to develop the dark-squared bishop. If white continues with the classical knight c3, developing the knight and preparing to take more space with e4, instead of playing d5, turning the game into the classical Queen's Gambit declined, we reach the Nimzo Indian after black plays bishop b4, pinning the c3 knight, which prevents e4 for the time being. The Nimzo Indian is a strategically rich opening with several plans available for both sides. Instead of trying to memorize several variations, it's a better idea to focus on understanding the typical themes and ideas in the opening. We can see a direct clash of ideas with the move a3, turning the game into the Zamish variation. Before black has a chance to consider retreating the bishop at a later stage, white spends a tempo to claim the bishop pair, provoking bishop takes c3 check. B takes c3. White now has the bishop pair, a long-term advantage, but must accept a worse pawn structure, especially the doubled c-pawns, an isolated pawn on a3, which denies the dark-squared bishop the possibility of playing bishop a3 for the time being. In these type of structures, white will often dream to play e4, grabbing more central space and trying to open up lines for the bishop pair. Black, on the other hand, needs to decide how to target white's center. Adding pressure against d4 is a common theme, so it's no surprise that black will often play c5, striking against d4 and trying to provoke another concession in white's pawn structure. If white plays d takes c5, creating isolated, tripled pawns, black may continue with knight a6, preparing to capture the c5 pawn. Or else black may play queen a5, attacking c5 and c3 at the same time. If white decides to take space with d5, black can stabilize the center with d6, preventing the d5 pawn from advancing and revealing the light-squared bishop's protection of e6. By playing d5, white's doubled c-pawns are fixed in place, and although they do help support the center, they are fixed weaknesses white needs to keep in mind. In response to c5, a common idea for white is to support the center with e3. This solid move supports the d4 pawn. The dark-squared bishop is now out of play for the time being, but white hopes to later expand in the center with e4 to liberate this piece once the center proves stable enough to do so. Black continues with the strategy to add pressure against d4 with knight c6, when white can activate the light-squared bishop with bishop d3, centralizing the bishop as well as supporting a future e4. Black can remain flexible and castle the king. White may decide to develop somewhat automatically with knight f3, but an interesting twist is knight e2. From the e2 square, the knight supports the center and allows the f-pawn to advance and take more space. A sensible continuation for black is d6, protecting the c5 pawn and allowing black to play e5 in the future if it proves desirable. Moving the pawn to e3 is often played with the short-term goal of supporting the d4 pawn, as well as allowing kingside development. But the e-pawn has a lust for expansion, which we see with e4. Taking space in the center, as well as opening up the dark squared bishop. Black could try to block the center with e5, but an instructive idea for black is to play the strange-looking, but positionally motivated knight e8, avoiding an annoying pin with bishop g5, as well as preparing to meet f4 with f5. After white castles the king, moving the king to safety and positioning the rook to support f4, f5 ideas. This is a good moment for black to focus on queenside play with b6. This move helps support the c5 pawn, which blockades white's doubled c-pawns. And attacking c4 is a common strategy for black in several lines in the Nimzo. Black prepares to play bishop a6, followed by knight a5, intensifying pressure against the c4 pawn. After b6, white is not interested to simply sit around and wait for this to happen, so white expands on the king side with f4. Black should not ignore white's idea and automatically play bishop a6, as f5 begins a dangerous kingside attack. Black can slow down white's kingside ambitions with f5. The f4 pawn is now stopped in its tracks, and the f5 pawn now restricts the light-squared bishop. Since the f4 pawn cannot advance, this means that white's dark-squared bishop remains less active. Black will be able to create good counterplay against white's broad center, but white is certainly not without resources as well. One idea to consider is d5, taking space in the center and adding pressure against black's light squares. Another option to consider is knight g3, adding pressure against f5, as well as increasing the mobility of the queen on d1. In this tension-filled position, both sides have plenty of resources to explore. Instead of immediately playing a3, allowing black to compromise white's pawn structure, a popular choice is to turn the game into the classical variation with queen c2. By supporting the knight on c3, white is ready to play a3 and gain the bishop pair without damaging the pawn structure. This move also supports a future e4, grabbing more space in the center. Queen c2 is an excellent choice, but it still has some drawbacks to keep in mind. Notice the d4 pawn is no longer protected, and this move also delays developing the king side. With these points in mind, this allows black to add pressure against the unprotected d4 pawn with c5 or knight c6. Black may also decide to simply grab space in the center with d5. And another solid choice to consider is simply castling the king. Just like in many other lines in the Nimzo, black remains flexible, waiting to see how white will continue before committing to a particular pawn structure. White's most common idea is to play a3, but if white tries to strike in the center immediately with e4, as long as black plays actively, white will not be able to roll over black's position. An instructive response for black is to strike back in the center with d5, preparing counterplay after e5. White takes space and attacks the knight, but it does allow black to jump in the center with knight e4, adding pressure against the pinned knight. When after bishop d3, black is able to counterstrike in the center with c5, emphasizing that white's center is far from stable, especially as white's king remains stuck in the center for the time being. Black enjoys good counterplay against white's ambitious choice. Rather than making the double-edged decision to take space in the center immediately with e4, white's main point is to collect the bishop pair with a3. Bishop takes c3 check, queen takes c3. White enjoys the bishop pair, but black has a lead in development and may later gain time against the exposed queen on c3. One popular option for black is to grab space in the center with d5, and another solid choice is b6, preparing the typical queenside fianchetto. White's dark-squared bishop can enter the action by pinning black's knight with bishop g5. When black takes control of the long light-squared diagonal with bishop b7. One of White's most active ideas is to fight for control of the center, as well as important light squares with f3. Blunting black's light-squared bishop, as well as supporting the e4 square. Black can put the question to the bishop with h6. And since White's opening strategy focuses on preserving the bishop pair, it makes sense to maintain the tension with bishop h4. We can now see another point behind f3. It allows the bishop to support the center with bishop f2 if necessary. Black certainly doesn't want to allow White to expand freely in the center, so a sensible reply is d5. Taking space in the center and discouraging e4. White can now support the center and prepare to develop the kingside with e3. When black continues to develop with the solid knight b to d7. Supporting the other knight, as well as preparing the thematic pawn break c5. One idea for White is to open the c-file with c takes d5. Opening up the c-file and revealing pressure against the c7 pawn. The point is, if black plays e takes d5, certainly not a bad move within itself, White will not be under any serious pressure, so White can play bishop d3, preparing to build an initiative with the bishop pair. Instead of this automatic recapture, black can take some of the sting out of White's plans with the surprising knight takes d5, attacking the queen and revealing the tension between black's queen and White's dark-squared bishop. After the queen trade, bishop takes d8, and knight takes c3. If White plays bishop takes c7, not only does this open up the c-file, which can benefit black's superior development, black can respond with knight d5, attacking the bishop and e3 pawn. So White typically plays bishop h4. Black's knight is able to move to safety and attack the center with knight d5. So White sensibly defends the center with bishop f2. White enjoys the bishop pair and is prepared to expand in the center with e4. Since e4 will weaken the d4 pawn, a natural idea for black is to respond with c5, adding pressure against the d4 pawn. White's bishop pair will remain a long-term factor, but black's solid position and easy development should promise an interesting strategic game filled with plenty of chances for both sides. Instead of immediately trying to gain the bishop pair with a3 or queen c2, White can focus on developing the kingside and supporting the center with e3. This is one of White's most popular systems against the Nimzo, known as the Rubinstein variation. e3 supports the center, prepares kingside development, and one day this pawn will often try to move to e4, grabbing more space in the center. You could spend an entire lifetime exploring all of the interesting variations in the Nimzo, including blockading the c4 pawn and striking in the center with c5, castling the king and preparing d5, and another interesting idea is b6. This move is very much in the spirit of the Nimzo. Instead of directly occupying the center with pawns, black plans to observe the center from a distance by fianchettoing the light-squared bishop on the long diagonal. Against b6, White's most straightforward response is bishop d3. starting to develop the king side and preparing a future e4 idea. The battle for the light squares continues with bishop b7, preventing white from playing e4, as well as attacking the g2 pawn. So a sensible continuation is knight f3, developing the knight as well as blocking the light-squared bishop's pressure against the g2 pawn. Once again, black has several options, including castling the king, adding pressure against the center with c5, or black can even decide to occupy the center directly with knight e4, blockading the e3 pawn as well as adding pressure against the pinned knight. White can combine defense and attack by playing queen c2, supporting the pinned knight as well as attacking the knight on e4. Black can now reinforce the center with f5, refusing to give ground and maintaining the tension in the center. After white castles the king to safety, it's important to remember that the c3 knight is not pinned forever, so now the knight is threatening to win material with knight takes e4. Black can voluntarily surrender the bishop pair with bishop takes c3, b takes c3, compromising white's pawn structure with the idea of trying to preserve the light-squared blockade in the center. Since white has not played a3 to provoke this exchange, notice white's bishop may enjoy the a3 to f8 diagonal in the future. This is a good moment for black to castle. White enjoys the bishop pair, but black's light-squared blockade in the center can prove quite annoying. White should prepare to evict the e4 knight with a move such as knight e1, or the more common knight d2, adding pressure against the knight and preparing f3. Since white's knight has vacated the f3 square, this allows black to play the active response queen h4, supporting the knight and building tension against white's kingside. White should continue with the plan of f3, when black can either simplify the position with knight takes d2, or keep the game complicated with knight g5. But a bad idea for white is to try and punish this adventurous queen move with g3, attacking the queen, but weakening the light squares around white's king. Instead of reacting to the attack against the queen, black can exploit these weak light squares with knight g5. White can still stay afloat with f3, a move which should have been played instead of g3. But if white accepts the queen with g takes h4, black's light-squared strategy triumphs with knight h3. Checkmate. In addition to the straightforward bishop d3, white has another interesting idea with knight e2, supporting the pinned knight, so if black captures the knight, white can play knight takes c3, maintaining a healthy pawn structure. One drawback to this move is it blocks the light-squared bishop, so the c4 pawn is loose. Black can immediately add pressure against this pawn with bishop a6. White sometimes responds with knight g3, revealing the light-squared bishop's defense of the c4 pawn. But a more popular option is a3. Black may decide to preserve the dark-squared bishop with bishop e7, definitely an option worth exploring. But another reasonable plan is to play bishop takes c3 check, surrendering the bishop pair after knight takes c3. White has avoided doubling the c-pawns, but black is ready to strike in the center with d5, adding more pressure against the c4 pawn. White can reinforce this pawn with b3, when black typically takes the chance to castle the king to safety. A flexible choice for white is bishop e2. Without a knight on f3, and with black's bishop on a6, it isn't out of the question to consider a future bishop f3, adding pressure down the long light-squared diagonal. Continuing to add pressure against white's center is a reasonable plan, so black may consider playing knight c6. Preparing knight a5, adding more pressure against the c4 pawn. One interesting idea for white is to play a4, awakening the dark squared bishop and also supporting the b5 square. The point is that after knight a5, adding more pressure against c4, white can develop the dark squared bishop with bishop a3, attacking black's rook on f8. After rook e8, white can simply ignore the tension against the c4 pawn and castle the king. Black should definitely consider reinforcing the center with c6, also discouraging future knight b5 ideas. But if black plays the materialistic d takes c4, white can play b4, attacking the knight and threatening b5. So black's knight is forced to lunge into enemy territory with knight b3. In response to knight b3, the rook can calmly step to the side with rook b1. White is ready to play b5, preparing to capture the pawn with bishop takes c4 and enjoy a strong position. In response to the Nimzo, instead of blocking the dark squared bishop with e3, a natural-looking but not especially popular move for white is bishop g5. If black can pin white with bishop b4, why can't white return the favor with bishop g5, activating the bishop before playing e3? There is certainly nothing wrong with this move, but with proper play, it isn't particularly challenging to black. Black can immediately question the bishop with h6. And unless white wants to surrender the bishop pair and help black develop with bishop takes f6, then the common response is bishop h4, maintaining the tension against black's knight, but now this bishop is committed to the king side. This may prove to be an important feature after black strikes in the center with a thematic c5. If white supports the center with e3, black is able to generate counterplay on the queen side with c takes d4, e takes d4, softening white's center, followed by the active queen a5. The absence of white's dark squared bishop on the queen side may be felt, as this bishop does not have the option to unpin the knight with bishop d2. If white tries to defend the knight while also keeping an eye on the d4 pawn with queen d3, black has the instructive resource knight e4. Taking advantage of the pinned knight, as queen takes e4 allows the unpleasant bishop takes c3 check. Black is ready to reinforce the knight with d5 when black enjoys a comfortable position. Instead of e3, white can decide to grab space with d5. White removes the tension from d4, but now creates tension between the d5 and e6 pawns. This allows black the option to consider the dynamic pawn sacrifice b5, or play a more calm, strategically minded game with bishop takes c3 check, doubling white's c-pawns after b takes c3, when black can commit to a dark squared central pawn structure with d6, preparing e5 so black's central pawn structure will restrict white's dark squared bishop. This typically leads to close games with plenty of positional maneuvering, in which black's solid position has not been especially challenged from the early development of white's dark squared bishop. From amateur to grandmaster, the Nimzo Indian is one of black's most popular defenses against d4. Instead of directly occupying the center with pawns, black controls the position with piece play, most notably the pin against white's knight on c3. Black is often willing to surrender the bishop pair, either to compromise white's pawn structure or gain time for comfortable development. White is willing to enter these lines thanks to the dynamic potential of the bishop pair, overall active piece play, and the rich pawn play available to fight for central dominance. If you enjoy positionally complex play, where ideas are generally more important than concrete variations, then you may very well find a home on either side of this fascinating opening.